Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7 by 7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. So the Ahsoka issue of Empire Magazine, I guess it's okay to call it the Ahsoka issue because they have her on the cover, it's the biggest spread and whatnot. Obviously they talk about a lot more things, but the Ahsoka issue, there are a lot of interesting assertions made in the issue. The first of them has to do with the fact that Ahsoka is the first primary alien main character in any Star Wars storytelling. And I read that and I thought, you know what? Like, that's actually correct. And I tried to nitpick it a little bit and I thought, well, I mean, technically, if you go back to the 80s and the Ewoks cartoon series, you know, every Ewok in there was a non-human main protagonist in there. But yeah, you know, I don't know if you really want to count that necessarily, and I don't know if I would fairly count that as well. So that was actually rather remarkable to consider. The fact that Ahsoka was the first non-human main character in Star Wars storytelling, at least as far as movies and animation go. Live action obviously hadn't happened at that point, except of course the Star Wars Holiday Special, which, you know, the less said about that, the better. But then there's also an assertion that Ahsoka Tano became an instantly iconic addition as a character to Star Wars storytelling. And, you know, like, that's a bit of revisionist history, and we would not be doing ourselves a service to, you know, ignore the fact that at the time there was some negative reaction to Ahsoka. Now, that reaction was unjustified, and you know, it probably didn't hurt that the first 4 episodes of the Clone Wars, which were made into the Clone Wars movies, were not very well received. But despite the fact that George Lucas himself wanted to see Anakin have a Padawan and was part and parcel of the creation of Ahsoka Tano, there were a lot of people who were pushing back on it, just as in our day and time there are a lot of people who push back on notions of other characters in Star Wars storytelling. So she wasn't necessarily instantly iconic, but she certainly became that over the course of the 5 seasons that she was in the Clone Wars, and then with her triumphant return in Star Wars Rebels, then even more beloved and rooted for in season 7 of the Clone Wars, and finally making the jump to live action in season 2 of The Mandalorian and season 1 of the Book of Boba Fett. I don't know if it's that the voices of the haters died down or got drowned out by the people who grew to love Ahsoka, or whether some of those previous hating folks became converts eventually. It's hard to say, and hopefully it holds promise for us as we see negative reactions to Star Wars characters in current storytelling. But be that as it may, Ahsoka is in a wonderful place right now and is going to be starring in one of the most highly anticipated series of 2023. And it seems like this may not be the end of it. They have not confirmed a season 2, but in the article, Rosario Dawson talks about how she is ready for season 2 and beyond. That also doesn't necessarily mean a season 3. It could also mean whatever other Star Wars series are coming, and of course Dave Filoni's movie that will be happening down the line at some point. But as opposed to the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, which was a very clearly self-contained story where the question of a season 2 would be more of, okay, like, what do we actually do next? As opposed to, say, for example, The Mandalorian, the first season, right, where the way they ended things, it's like, oh yeah, this story absolutely has to continue in some fashion. That's the way they laid it out. It sounds like the way Rosario Dawson, who plays Ahsoka, is talking about this, these 8 episodes are not necessarily a totally self-contained situation. They are going to lead to something more, and we've already kind of been given to believe that they will with, again, the Dave Filoni movie talk, but also with, you know, other Star Wars storytelling. We don't know how and whether this is going to link to Skeleton Crew, for example, whenever that happens to come out, and eventually to season 4 of The Mandalorian as well. Not to mention the Book of Boba Fett, and quite honestly, I think we're done with Boba Fett for the most part. I mean, there were opportunities in season 3 of The Mandalorian where they could have reached out to Boba Fett and brought him in as a character, and it didn't happen, so it makes me think that, yeah, that train has sailed, to quote Austin Powers. So that, I think, is a good place to put a pin in our discussion of the Ahsoka feature in Empire Magazine. We'll talk about characters tomorrow and where they're at and the time frame for the Ahsoka series and much more, but that's going to do it for today's episode of the podcast. It just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for it as always, and may the Force be with you wherever in the world you may be.
Wars 7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the force be with them. All original content is copyright by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.